We should be in motion. There we go. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another event of the Business Book Club. We are live, and tonight we have a very, very unusual, interesting author. And I'm going to share with you more about Ben in a moment. But first of all, just a reminder of why we do what we do. The Business Book Club is a non-profit organization, and we exist because we are interested in sharing knowledge. Hence that we have an author each month that donates their time and their knowledge to the Business Book Club, which we then share to you, our audiences. But not just that, we also share book donations to libraries and less privileged communities. So if there are any books lying around the house, or your parents are perhaps moving and you need a new home for those books, there are a massive amount of libraries in South Africa that are in dire need of knowledge and books. We've been very fortunate in the past, and we've collected over 8,000 books that we have shared right across South Africa. And with those books, you make a difference. I always think about how privileged we are with our access to knowledge. We live in some of the most amazing times, and our ability to just access knowledge is so simple. We go onto our phones, we go onto our laptops, and boom, there's the answer. But not everybody has that privilege. And sharing books and sharing that knowledge to a wider audience is our way of paying it forward and trying to make the world that we live in a better place. So once again, welcome to the Business Book Club. Big, massive welcome to Ben Wiener. Now, the interesting thing about Ben is he is not from South Africa. He is our second international author. And although he's not from South Africa, he's been here. He's been Cape Point. He's just shared a very interesting story about his son and him visiting Cape Point and getting to know our country a bit. So Ben and I have been in communication via email. Ben contacted me. And I was really thinking about, is this in line with what we do? Because if you look at the title of his book, Murder at First Principles, you go, Jacques, have you gone off your rocket? Why are you bringing in novels? The Business Book Club has never been about novels. You've always been about business. But if you dive deeper into Murder at First Principles, it is a brilliant, brilliant book that speaks to the 7 powers, which is a business strategy. And we're going to unpack that with you tonight. But before we do that, just Ben, a very, very big welcome to you. Welcome to this conversation. It's your first time on the Business Book Club, and we'd just like to really, really welcome you and looking forward to a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Jacques, for having me. And I have to say, really kudos to you on your mission. I'm a huge fan of paying it forward, so that really resonates. I'm a huge fan of reading and making information available to people. So what you're doing is super important, and real congrats for all the work that you're doing. Fantastic.
Great, Ben. Thank you very much for that. And for our audience out there, guys, if you've got any questions that you would like to ask Ben as we continue this conversation, please feel free. On the right-hand side, you should have what we call a chat box. Type your message. Ben and I will pick up those messages. We'll answer as many as we can. And you can then basically be part of this conversation. So that's what it's about. It's about sharing knowledge, debating some of the knowledge, and really, really going into it so that, at the end of the day, we can be better people. All right, Ben, let's start with you. Are you a full-time author, or, what's your daytime job?
Not at all. Writing a book was probably one of the strangest things that I ever did in my life, and I've done some strange things. In my professional life, I'm a venture capitalist, so I manage my own venture capital fund here in Israel. As many of your listeners probably know, Israel is a hotbed of startup activity. My wife and I moved to Jerusalem from the United States about 23 years ago. And I was looking to get into the technology scene here in Israel. Before that, I was a lawyer. I have a law degree. I have a law degree from Columbia University in New York, which is really one of the top schools in the country. And after I graduated law school, I got accepted to clerk on Israel's Supreme Court. So we came here for the year, which is based in Jerusalem. We came here for the year about 25 years ago, and we just loved it. And we had sort of had thoughts about moving here one day, but during that year in 96, 97, we decided that we wanted to accelerate our plans to move here. So we went back to New York, practiced law for a little bit. And then by the summer, end of 98, we were back in Jerusalem for good. And we, raised our kids here in Jerusalem. To make a really long story short, after I left law around the dot-com era, I left law and jumped into a startup. So for the first, 15, 16, 17 years of my career, I was, just a startup guy working in small companies, big companies, never dreaming of being a venture capitalist and never dreaming of writing a book. In 2013, I started Jumpspeed Ventures, which is my venture capital fund, raised a little bit of money and started to invest in local early stage technology companies. And this is where the book story begins. So at the age of 40, I'm now 51. At the age of 43, I changed my career again to go into a field that I didn't know much about, raised money from other people, which is a huge responsibility. And I felt that I needed to get smart, like very, very quickly about technology companies and specifically decision-making, like how to pick from the hundreds of fantastic ideas that you hear in a year, how do you pick like the 2 or 3 that are good? So I started to read, voraciously, mostly business books, like mostly stuff in my field. And I have continued to do that. So I read probably 70 to 100 books a year. The vast majority of them are, nonfiction, technology, business, investing. But once you start to read, you start to get curious about other things. And I've definitely branched out into fiction, science fiction, and all sorts of other things. One of the most important books that I've read in the last few years is this business strategy book called 7 Powers by Hamilton Helmer, which you mentioned. And to try to make the pitch for 7 Powers, like I've read many of the most famous business books, and not to, this is probably not the right club to badmouth business books, but after a while, you find that some of these things are just repeating themselves, or worse, like you feel that the author maybe is like backpropping some idea that they have into factual scenarios. And I think the third critique I have of business books is that sometimes they're a little bit too esoteric and they're hard to apply. Like I'm running a business. I have a startup. I have a fund. I don't want to just read a book. I want to have actionable takeaways that I can apply to my daily life. And when I read 7 Powers, I was like, oh my God, this guy wrote like the perfect business book. It's not easy to digest. It's a thin book, but the concepts are heavy. But if you can understand the 7 concepts, they're only 7. Like these are the 7 sustainable competitive advantage powers that companies use. You have to have one of these if you want to fend off your competition for a long time. And these are they. And if you understand them, you can apply them and they work. And when I started to go deeper into Helmer and who he was and what he had done and how he had gotten to these 7 principles, what he calls the 7 powers, I was blown away. And I guess the second part of it was some of the people that I follow and respect the most in the industry swear by this book. So I had heard about it from a bunch of podcasts or other famous people like Daniel Ek of Spotify and Patrick O'Shaughnessy and the Acquired FM guys. And like everyone's talking about this amazing book, but the people that I knew, like the startup founders, had never heard of it. They had heard of 0 to 1. They had heard of Crossing the Chasm. They had heard of a number of books that I'm sure your club has looked at. Nobody knew this book. So like the smartest people knew the book. Regular people didn't know the book. And I wanted to do something to promote, to get people more aware of this book, because and we'll get into what Helmer's book says and why it's so important. But again, I'm still explaining why I wrote a book. So I had in parallel been researching storytelling as like an academic concept. Like I felt that as an early stage investor, I hear, hundreds of pitches a year, and most of them are terrible. And in many cases, the people attached to the pitches are amazing and the ideas are amazing, but they just don't know how to present a clear story in 20 minutes. Like, they just completely bungle the pitch. And I was trying to think about how I could teach pitch structure as like a proper field of study. So these two things like dovetailed, and I started to read many, many books and articles about storytelling. And that got me deeper into like novel structure, book structure, screenplay structure, because all of those things are similar to, believe it or not, to a startup pitch. And pretty soon I realized that I had these one or two ideas for things that I wanted to teach. I wanted to teach Helmer's 7 Powers. I wanted to teach a few other things. And they gelled in my mind as fictional stories rather than as just another article from some stupid venture capitalist saying, hey, this book is really important, read this book. This crazy story came into my head of, what if I taught the 7 Powers through a crazy murder mystery where there's a serial killer who is, sitting with this book, by this real book, and picking like murder victims. If somebody picked up my book, it would force them to understand the 7 Powers, because you need to understand the 7 Powers in order to understand the plot of this murder mystery. That's the way my mind works. I might be a little bit cuckoo, but the story came together. And the more I thought about the story, the more I wanted to read it. And the only way I was going to read it was if I wrote it. So, and I had spent all this time, like a year or two, researching story structure and writing. And I felt, you know what, I think I have the tools to put together a draft. I'm not going to talk to anybody about it, because if, except for my wife, like if anybody thought, if anybody knew I was writing a book, they'd think I was crazy. And when the first draft came out decent of Murder at First Principles, I started to show it to people, like just people who are not in business, like my wife's friends who read fiction and don't read business books, because I wanted to make the story strong enough that even if you were not that interested in business, you would get drawn into the story and pick up the business principles along the way. So I invested heavily in developing the plot and the characters. And I think what came out was a book that, if you look at the reviews and if you talk to people who've read it, like most of the people who love the book are not even business people. So certainly those people who like business are going to get even more out of it, because it's a fun book, it's entertaining, and it sort of is a teaser, or gets you sort of it dips your toes into Helmer's principles in a really wacky and fun and engaging way.
No, I must say those reviews were definitely one of the reasons, Ben, that I thought, geez, I've got to interview this guy. I've got to hear what he's got to say, because your reviews on Amazon are really, really great.
Those are unsolicited. I don't even know who most of those people are. Like, they're just people who found it and liked it, and
they are people who like you. And obviously the other benefit is there's an audio version. So, for those of us who travel a lot, that's also pretty cool. And then afterwards you go and you Google it just to check, where do these 7 powers fit in? And trying to figure out, with your main character, who is the psychopath, the murderer. Exactly.
Don't give away the ending. So the audiobook, I really recommend the audiobook, because the book, my book, is written in first person, or is told in first person by a young woman, which makes it even more strange. Like, I'm a 51-year-old guy, and I wrote a book being told by a young woman. So there was no way that I could narrate that book. Like, it's I went and I drove and I did these things. So I needed to find a young woman to narrate the book. I found somebody who, when I heard her voice, I was like, she's a professional narration actress. When I heard her audition, I said, oh my gosh, that is the voice that I've been writing. Mm-hmm. So she did an amazing job. I wrote to her, she's an actress and she does all kinds of voices. And I wrote to her and I said, just narrate this book as if it happened to you. Like, this is your natural voice. You don't need to act. And I think it came out fantastic. So I highly recommend the audio version.
No, she did a fantastic job, and the mimicking of other characters when they came up. Having a deeper voice or having a different tone. It was just, at stages I thought, was it actually her or was it somebody else that she's mimicking? So absolutely brilliant, absolutely amazing.
It was important to me to have a diverse character base because so many fictional, especially murder books, like the murder mysteries are all, it's always a man. He's the detective. He's, sleeping around with all the women. Like, it's just the same story. And my story is basically told from the point of view of two very strong, very different women who are a little bit at odds with each other. They're struggling with each other as well as with this case. And it gets into a much more of a diverse character base than most fictional novels that you read. And that was really important to me, to bring out different voices and make it more appealing to like a broader audience. So again, I had all these other things going on. What I was really trying to do was pitch, 7 powers and business strategy. But along the way, I wanted to invest heavily in a story that would be fun for a wide audience to read, especially women. And I think if you notice at the end, I mentioned that I'm donating the proceeds to a women in tech organization that I'm on the board of. This is all about 7 powers, but the derivative benefits are for, exposing it to a wider readership, getting women involved. The proceeds support women in tech. So those things are really, really important to me.
Excellent. And Ben, I actually think it could be a nice script for a movie. To be honest with you, I really think it has got legs for something like that.
If you have any connections with producers, I'm happy to.
Well, we never know, spreading the word. Sometimes you've got to put the intention out there, and these things happen a lot easier. I mean, you as a venture capitalist should know, sometimes it's about what you speak and what you're intentional about is the stuff that happens to you. Ben, I want to just spend a moment. I want to share my screen with you, and hopefully I can get that right. Can you see my screen, Ben? I just want to check in with you.
I can see it. It's small for me to read because I have bad eyesight, but I know this by heart, I think.
Oh, good. So I'm just gonna, and it's just for the benefit of our listeners and our audience. When we talk about the 7 powers, it's an interesting concept. And what I've got here is, just highlighting those 7 powers. And, we're obviously not going to have enough time tonight to delve through all 7. But, we're talking there about counter-positioning. We're talking about scale economies. We're talking about switching cost. There's network economies. There's process power. There's branding. And there's cornered resources. Now, obviously, I've just mentioned a bunch of words. I think it's probably Greek for most people, and one really needs to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding it. Hence why you've got to read his book, Ben's book. In that you will find a lot more where they actually talk about example companies and going in and explaining it in a very, very good way. But tonight you've got the privilege of getting Ben to share as much as we can in the time we have, probably about 2 or 3. And to get Ben's take on it. So Ben, I'm gonna leave it open to you. Which of these 7 powers? I mean, you're a venture capitalist, right? So in your world, you see this a lot. And to apply this to the benefit of a wider audience, which of the 7 powers do you think is most common? Or let me rather ask this. Is most underutilized and that can provide the biggest leverage if properly understood?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that question. I'll just tweak 2 things that you said. I actually don't see this a lot, which is why venture capital is so tough. So what Helmer is saying in his book is that only a few companies really make it big, and he's figured out over decades of research, he's figured out what those 7 things are that make those few companies succeed. So he's not claiming, it's really, really important to stress this if we're talking about the book. He's not claiming that there's a handbook that like any company can use and all you need to do is apply these powers. It's exactly the opposite. It's like, these are the things to investigate and look for in the successful, if you plan to have a successful company for many, many years, you better figure out which one of these 7 powers you can potentially leverage, and then figure out how to apply it. What he's saying is most companies are never going to get to one of these 7 powers. But if you are an investor like me, when I'm looking at a new company, what I'm thinking of is one of the many things I'm thinking of is, will this company have the potential to achieve one of these 7 powers? If I don't feel, if it's an interesting idea and a cool team, but I don't see the potential for them one day achieving one of these 7 powers, then I have to pass, because it could be interesting but not sustainable for a long time. So he's not claiming that like other business books, are sold where they're like, anybody can pick up this book and make $1 million. This is almost the opposite. This is saying these are the characteristics of the rare companies that succeed. And if you're an investor and you're looking for those companies, or if you're a founder of a startup and you hope to be one of those companies, you better understand these things and hope to take steps to get them. That's sort of introduction number 1. Introduction number 2 is, sorry?
No, interesting. I mean, I love that, because what you're saying is you're using it as a filter mechanism to determine where you're going to get a return on your investment. But what it is also saying to our audiences out there who are not venture capitalists, that if they've got a business and they want to leverage it, they've got to understand the macro environment or the bigger environment so that they can apply these strategies to be able to grow their businesses.
Yeah, or adopt these strategies, or see which ones apply. So that's sort of introduction number 1. Introduction number 2 is that these 7 powers are not all attainable at the same point in the company's life. And Helmer, my only critique of Helmer is that he doesn't explain this, or doesn't kind of drop this on you until deep towards the end of his book. So he talks about the 7 powers first, and then he says it towards the end. By the way, they don't all happen at the same time. So, for example, he divides the life of a startup company into 3 stages. There's like the inception or the takeoff stage. There's the growth stage, and then there's the stability stage. Only 2 of these powers can a company potentially use at the beginning. So like when a startup company is starting, it only has 2 potential Helmer powers to use. One is counter-positioning, one is cornered resource. The other ones, scale economies, network economies, switching costs, you can't start off with a switching cost. That only comes into play if you've been successful sort of in the middle of the company. And then branding and process power are things, and I can explain each one of these quickly. Those are things that even if a company has the potential to get them, won't be able to get branding power or process power until later in its life. So these things need to be planned for in some cases rather than adopted from inception. That's a really, really important point. The other important thing, which he doesn't say until the end of the book or deeper into the book, is that these powers only come into play if the company has started off with some unique innovation. So if you are running a pizza place or a restaurant or a safari in Medique or whatever, you may have an amazing business, but you probably are not going to be potentially owning one of these 7 powers because your business is kind of generic. It's not a very unique business. These 7 powers layer on top of companies like startups or technology startups that start with some unique invention or innovation. And then, even then, in order to succeed long-term, need to then adopt or apply or capture one of these 7 powers. So those are all really, really important introductions, which he doesn't really say till deeper into the book, but I think that it's important for people to understand if they're just getting to know the concept of the 7 powers from scratch.
So I've got a question then. So are these 7 powers applicable to all business models? So does your business does it depend on your business model? And then what about companies like a Starbucks or Amazon who doesn't really do anything very unique? They're just doing it differently.
Right. So in my book, in Murder at First Principles, I use Amazon as one of the examples. So one of the characters, or a number of the characters, work at Amazon, and the investigators are trying to figure out if Amazon would be one of the 7 powers. And in the book, I claim that Amazon, they believe, and I believe, that Amazon would be at least one of the 7 powers. And that's why it's been able to achieve such incredible sustainable growth. The power that I think Amazon represents is process power, which is at least, and maybe some other ones too, which applies deeper into Amazon's life. So Amazon only was able to achieve process power in a nutshell is where the company has developed some unique process or unique ability to do something that even if everybody else knows what it is, they can't copy it just because it's just so hard. It's just so ingrained in the management of the company. And it takes a long time to build that kind of process power. So like Toyota developed the quintessential process power when it manufactured cars. And I think he even uses this example in the book. Toyota would invite other car makers, like its competitors, to their factory and say, this is how we, like, they were so confident that they had the process power down that they would show it to other competitors who would then go home and try to copy it and couldn't do it because it was that special. It was so ingrained in what the company does. So I believe Amazon has, among other things, process power, which it only earned after years of competing and refining its model. Starbucks, I'm not sure if I would use that as a seven powers example. It's a great company, but I think that if you open up, in America there is a company I think called Coffee Leaf and Tea Bean or whatever, and their whole strategy was to find Starbucks and open up a coffee shop right next door and just take their customers. There was nothing Starbucks could do to stop that, and frankly, they were susceptible to that competition. So I don't think, to make a long answer short, I don't think Starbucks, in my opinion, has one of the seven powers. I don't think. Maybe branding, but that's about it. Amazon, I would say, does have process power.
Okay. So if we look at startups, so let's take a process, or let's take one of the seven powers that relate to a startup, and then let's look at a power that relates to either process or branding, to something that to a business that's been in the market a while. Which process or which powers of the seven powers would you like to unpack with our audience tonight?
Well, I think the ones that are the most fun are the ones that are hardest to understand. So counterpositioning, I'll start with the easy ones. Like branding, we understand. Branding means that simply you will pay more money for the same product because it has a logo on it. Like I can sell you a Nike sweatshirt for $5 more than a generic sweatshirt that's made by the same factory just because it has the Nike swoosh on it. That's pure branding power. They have the ability to command more money for an identical product just because of their name. That's really hard to achieve. That takes decades or sometimes hundreds of years to get that kind of power. Most of us are never going to get that power in our companies. Process power also happens, like we said, deep in the end, where you've been operating for so long that you've developed all sorts of tricks and tips and things that people don't even possibly are not able to copy. Those I'll sort of leave at the end because those are really cool when you find them, but they're very hard to achieve when you're a business owner. The more interesting ones are the ones that happen in the beginning of the life of a company. So I said, for example, the two that you can start with, according to Helmer, are cornered resource and counterpositioning. Cornered resource is what it sounds like. You have a patent or a mining right. You have some sort of monopoly over something. That's a great position to have. If you can have a legal monopoly on something because the government has given it to you, the government has given you the patent, the government has given you the mining rights to mine something, well, you have a very defensible position for a long time. You have power. But counterpositioning is really, really interesting. Counterpositioning, according to Helmer, is where you are doing something that even though the incumbent competitors see what you're doing, they can't allow themselves to do it your way. So, for example, take like Netflix when it first started to mail out DVDs when Blockbuster was so powerful. If Blockbuster started to mail out their tapes and their DVDs, they would cannibalize their business. You could argue that Kodak, for example, suffered from counterpositioning when digital cameras started to come out. Kodak, which was so built on film, couldn't allow itself. They just couldn't figure out, like management-wise, to change direction that quickly. And he says one of the reasons why the big companies will fail and be susceptible to counterpositioning is because the managers are like too afraid to get fired. Like it's such a bold move to change direction and do what the startup is doing that they'll just say, I'd rather risk the startup succeeding than get fired by the board. So counterpositioning is a tricky one to understand, but it's one of the most exciting to do if you can do it, Because what you're saying is, I'm going to do this new business model and compete with these giant companies, and they're going to see me and they're not going to be able to change direction because it's going to be too scary for them, because they're going to be too afraid of losing their jobs or hurting their business because they're running, quarter to quarter. And I don't care because I'm a startup. I just want to, try to attack them. So it's a pure David Goliath scenario. And I love how he explains that one. The other one that I think, again, if you contrast two that we think we know what they mean, but he explains them differently. So network economies is pretty famous. This is network effects. This is the basic idea where every additional customer that you get not only gets additional benefit, but provides additional benefit for all the existing customers. So think of social networks like Facebook. Facebook gets better for member number 1 when member number 2,000,001 joins, because the more people that are on the network, the more information there is, and it's more valuable for everybody, not just for that new member. Scale economies is a little bit different. Scale economies, we think, means economies of scale. And he explains that's not what he means. Scale economies mean that when you get to be bigger than your competitors, you can start to invest in things that your competitors can't invest in. So he uses Netflix as an example, where it wasn't that Netflix achieved scale economies by being big and reduce their expenses. Netflix achieved scale economies by being able to take their profits and buy shows, which in turn made them more attractive to more users, which in turn made them more money, which in turn gave them more money to buy more shows. So it created this flywheel of being big, being able to let you invest in new things. What he's saying is just getting big isn't good enough on its own. Lots of companies get big and then eventually get eaten by their competitors. Getting big is worthwhile if you can invest those profits in new things that your competitors don't have the resources to invest in. And I think that's another thing that Amazon did incredibly well. Amazon is probably also scale economies, because they took all the money that they were making from us buying shoes and books and clothing and built AWS, and they built all these other systems that their competitors couldn't possibly build because they didn't have that kind of money. So scale economies is about reinvesting the profits into new initiatives rather than just reducing expenses or reducing costs and achieving economies of scale. So that's a nuance that economics wonks might appreciate. I studied economics. I loved how he wrote about scale economies in a way that I didn't expect. Like, I expected him to just explain scale economies is economies of scale. He explains that that's not what he means. Scale economies only works as a long-term power if you're investing those additional resources into new initiatives that further distance you from your competition. So I think counterpositioning and scale economies are the two that I loved reading about because they were so new to me. Like, I didn't understand those the way I thought I did before I read the book.
Your scale economies, I'd like to unpack that one, because that one is very interesting. And Netflix, I guess, is a very interesting excuse me, Ben. Netflix is a very interesting example. But did Netflix not? They took their profits and they basically invested in their value chain. In other words, they were cutting out other parties delivering to them, and they created their own studio. So they created their Disney studios. So they weren't reliant on that part of the industry. They created their own value chain.
Right. So Helmer is a huge Netflix fan, and he even has an endorsement on the book, on the back cover, from Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix. So the two of them are very close. And I think Helmer made a lot of money investing in Netflix early. He's a huge fan of the company. And what he says, he spends a lot of time talking about Netflix in the book. And therefore, I spend a number of my examples in my murder book. A couple of the kids in the book work at Netflix, and it comes up a lot in the book because it's so central to what he's saying, to what Helmer is saying. One of the many things he says is a company A can have more than one power. So it's not like you have to choose one. If you're an amazing company, you might have 3 of these 7, and then you're really defended against competition. And he claims that while he believes Netflix currently, today, represents scale economies, the way I described to you, where they're investing all this profit into multi-hundred million dollar new films. It got its start probably using other powers like counter positioning. So a company can evolve. The great of the greats can start with one power and then upgrade or switch gears to another power. It's not like you only get to choose one power for the rest of your life as a company. You can actually jump from power to power. And it's likely, according to him and according to me, that Netflix started off as counter positioning, and then upgraded to scale economies once they got bigger. So they really, it's as if they were sitting with the book, and like once they realized that they were at the takeoff stage, they did counter positioning, and then once they passed that stage and got into like growth stage, they shifted gears like you would shift in an automatic car, and adopted a whole new power of scale economy. So meaning you're right, they probably represent more than one, and they probably implemented different powers at different stages in the company life. And the really amazing companies are able to do that.
Ben, are there any of these examples that you don't necessarily agree with? In other words, are there any examples from the author of the Seven Powers that you not agree with or you're on the fence with?
That's a really great question. I'm glad you asked that. There was one, I so believe in this book. It's almost like a religious belief, but like any religion, you can ask questions about stuff. So I think, yeah. And I read it with a critical eye, and I kept thinking, is there something here, like, just like you asked, is there something here that I don't agree with? Because that kind of proves that I agree with the rest. Like if everything sounds good, you're probably, missing something. I'll give you one that I found odd and that I think I probably disagree with. In his discussion of cornered resource, okay, which you would think would be, like he says, patents, mining rights, intellectual property rights, where you have a defensible monopoly. He uses as his example Pixar, and he claims that Pixar, the animation studio, was a cornered resource power because they had hired all of the smart, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says cornered resources can be people too, and you can corner the market in the smart people. So he claims that Pixar's strength was that they basically employed the 5 or 10 best animators in the business all at the same time, were all at that company. Now, I don't think that necessarily is correct. And I don't think that necessarily works all the time, because people are not slaves to your company. And if you make a mistake, or if somebody gets into trouble, which is what happened in Pixar at some point, had to leave the company, you can't defend that resource the same way you can defend a patent. Like if you own a patent, you own a patent, and nobody can take it away from you unless they find something to impinge the patent. If you happen to have 5 great managers who are fantastic, it's hard for me to believe that there's nobody else in the world that's that talented. And even if there isn't, there's no guarantee you can keep those people for a long time. Somebody could hire, it's a free market. Like people could hire them away for paying them, 3 times as much. So I think that his use of people as a cornered resource is a little bit questionable. And it's one of the only things that he says in the book that I think is hard to defend. I reference this a little bit in my book. Like I try to kind of hint at it in the story, because I kind of refer to one of the investigators as a cornered resource, but I'm kind of also like making fun of it, because nobody lasts forever. Nobody lives forever. And people don't stay in the same place forever. So that's the one thing I think I take a little bit of issue with, but that just proves that the rest of the book is so amazing. His book, not my book.
Yeah. So, to get back to your book, that's just really, really what I enjoyed was, and you must have had like a whole mind map of this thing up against your wall, just plotting the characters and the companies, and because you basically had 3 components. You've got characters, and then you've got companies, and then you've got your 7 powers. So,
yep.
And then there's possibilities. So now the tricky thing comes in is, which is which. because some of your people have worked at previous companies and now they're at a different company. And then those companies could mean certain powers. And the complexity of actually getting to grips with that, must have been even hard for you as the author to, unpack it and not confusing yourself.
Yeah, that was part of why it was so fun to write the book, because I was trying to trick myself. Like you had to balance, like you can't make a book too complex where people like put it down and say, okay, this is too complicated. There is a part, I think in chapter 9 of my book, where there's actually, you see a picture of the chart that they drew on the wall. So you can go back to it. You can go back to it and see, like, if you get lost, you don't have to get lost, but in case you want to refer back, there is that chart like midway through the book. So you can, but it's constantly changing. Like they're constantly figuring out new things. They're constantly reapplying different parts of the book. So it was tricky as a writer to make a complicated story still make sense to like my 15-year-old kid who was reading it, who doesn't know anything about business and wasn't going to be able to follow 27 different possibilities of characters. So I appreciate that you appreciate that. Like it was hard to do that, but I spent a lot of time and effort to make that easier for the reader and more fun for the reader to navigate, even though the plot was like so complicated that you really don't know what's happening till the end. And that was part of the mischievous way of writing. Like I really have I have a mischievous streak, and this is not the kind of book where I expected anybody to figure out what was happening until the end. But I didn't want to make it like, if you read, I don't want to go too far off topic, but if you read Agatha Christie, I really built the book based on Agatha Christie. And, I have deep respect for Agatha Christie, and she was incredibly famous. She wrote, 100 years ago or, 90 years ago. And it was a different time, and she could do things that I didn't want to allow myself to do. So she could just hide facts that there were just no way you would know, and then just spring it on you at the end and say, okay, the butler did it, and here are all these like things that I didn't tell you in the book. But you kind of feel like when you read a book like that, you're like, hey, you kind of, yeah, you got it. So I tried to embed the actual clues. That was also tricky, like to embed clues, but kind of have so many different things going on where at the end of the book, when you figure out, or when they figure out what happened, you can actually go back to the beginning and say, oh, I saw that, but I didn't realize what it was. Yeah. That was also, there were a lot of charts going on when I wrote the book, but it was part of the fun and keeping everything in line and making sense. I mean, it was a lot of fun to put it all together for me. Like I said, this is a book I wanted to read, so I had to write it. But it was as fun for me to read it as it was to write it.
I think it was at the last victim is when I got the clue of who it could possibly be. But it was,
don't give any
very
no spoilers. No spoilers.
No, definitely not a spoiler. No, I won't. That would just be disrespectful. But there was. But I loved the nuances and the like. It makes you think. Who could it possibly be? But you do give clues, and those clues are, especially if you go and reread it, or if you reflect back on it, you go, okay, well, that was obvious. But you only know that it was obvious when you have hindsight as your friend.
Exactly. But I wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to be mischievous. I wanted people to smile when they put it down. Again, just to be clear, like, we're talking about a serial killer murder book. People might get the wrong impression. Like, it's a fun book. There's no blood. There's no violence, believe it or not. There's no visible murdering. The bodies kind of show up afterwards. There's no sex. There's no overt sex. There's some references. Like, this was a book that I was happy to give to my 14, 15-year-old kids, even though it's about somebody who's walking around killing people. So I had to really delicately deal with some, heavy topics. And my personality is to make it fun. I'm not a dark, person. So even though it's a murder mystery, there is a lot of humor in it, and it's a fun, clean. There's a couple of bad words which I write at the end to my kids, like, just because I wrote these bad words, don't think you could say them at home. Like, they once if you read Vonnegut, like Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of my favorite writers, so he has some very dark stuff in his books. And at one point, they burned some of his books in America. And they interviewed him and said, "How do you feel about this?" He's like, "I don't know what they want from me. I don't say those words. There are bad people in my books, and they use bad words," like as if he hadn't written them, So I have some really bad guys in my book. It's a murder mystery. Like, there's some really bad people. You think they walk around saying, "Shoot, darn it, oh shucks"? No, they're bad guys, but I wouldn't say those words, right?
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun.
Ben, I've had a lot of fun with you tonight. Discussing the 7 habits. The 7 habits, the 7 powers. I really think, the big takeaway here for me specifically is the fact that you actually got to plan for these 7 powers. They're not a seven go-to steps, or 7 steps that if you pick one, it's something that you've got to actually dive and understand that you move through them, but you've got to choose them to grow your business and leverage it.
Not everybody needs to be a multi-billion-dollar company. Like, I'm not here to say that everybody listening to this call needs to be the next Amazon or Netflix. This is more like, if you're in the technology startup space and you're starting with a springboard of a fantastic innovation, you should already be thinking about one of these 7 powers as what's going to propel you into further growth. As an investor, it's really important to me. So I won't invest in a startup if I don't think that it has the potential to get one of these 7 powers. They don't always make it. They don't always get where we think they're going to go, but at least I have to believe that they can potentially get one of them. But it doesn't mean that if you're operating a restaurant or a small business or an accounting firm, you shouldn't read the book, or it's not going to be relevant. It's still a great book, but it's just not like a playbook where any business can achieve one of these 7 powers. It's a specialized book for a special kind of business, but it also helps you understand, if you are a fan of business and management and big companies, it helps you get a better understanding of the ones that do make it big. I think through Helmer's lenses, you can better understand and play the game of, like, okay, these public, the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, which ones do they represent? In fact, in my book, there's even sort of a humorous disagreement about Google, because the two of the main characters are disagreeing about which one of the powers Google would be. So, like, it's a fun sort of party game or parlor game to pick like a top company and say, okay, you know what? Let's put Helmer's 7 powers filter to the test, and let's see which one of the 7 powers we think this company captured. And you can actually debate it and argue it. So it's a fun read, even if you're not trying to build one of these businesses. It's still helpful to understand the world that we live in.
Absolutely. Ben, thank you so much for donating your time to the Business Book Club. Thank you for having this amazing conversation with us, sharing with us the knowledge about 7 powers. It's absolutely fantastic. We really appreciate your generosity. And what's the best part of learning is when you make it fun. And I definitely think you've achieved that. You've made learning fun through this book. It's a fun way to learn about the 7 powers. And then if people want to dive more into 7 powers, go and buy the book of 7 powers. But just to learn in a fun way, get Ben's book first. It will give you the insights of whether this is something that you would want to do. And then based on all the fun that you have, you can then decide whether you would actually want to dive deeper into the conversation.
That was my goal in writing it, was to get more people to, I think the two best pieces of feedback I get are, hey, we read your book and we loved it, and we went out and bought 7 powers and we're going to read that next. So that was really what I wanted to do. I wanted to give people a fun time, get them interested. And then rather than replacing, like, you can't read my book instead of Helmer's book, I wanted to get people to then go out and read or borrow or buy Helmer's book. And I know for a fact that many people that have read my book have then gone out and bought his book. So that I've done my job.
Awesome. And you've done a brilliant job at that. Ben, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us tonight. And Ben, have you got any other books in the making? I mean, you obviously have a talent for this stuff. So,
I do. Yeah, stay tuned. Book two.
When are you thinking of releasing the next one?
Well, it's going through a rewrite now. It's called Fever Pitch. It is a book about a startup founder who cannot pitch his startup to save his life and needs to pitch his startup to save his life.
Okay.
He gets involved.
We would love to have you on the Business Book Club again. So as soon as it's out, let us know, and we'll see if we can continue this conversation. We'd love that.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. And again, congrats and thank you for all the work that you do. It's really important, and I really applaud you for what you do.
Thank you so much, Ben. All the best. Chat soon.
Thanks so much. Okay, take care.